Welcome everyone. It's always a great privilege to have you here, and this is our introductory lesson to the book of Revelation. You'll see there in the middle panel on your screen here, I've created a short summary of what I'd just like to look at this evening, and that is basically approaches to the book of Revelation, some suggestions on how it could be interpreted, and then I'll give you my information on how I like to interpret it, what works best for me, and then if there are any questions from our live audience at the end, you are of course more than welcome to ask. So without further ado, let me just jump in, and a disclaimer before I go in: my perspective on the book of Revelation does not necessarily represent that of my pastor, nor does it necessarily represent that of my church. So I'd like to keep that out there, or at least get that out there before we get started. And I'd also like to say at the start of this that I'm going to be summarizing quite a bit from Beale's commentary on Revelation, as well as Michael Gorman's book, Reading Revelation Responsibly. These are two sources that I've looked at. They've provided a little bit of a backbone for my approach in how best to communicate this information, and then I've obviously added bits here and there in terms of how I understand, how I interpret things. So that being said, let us jump right into the title that you can see there in the middle, our approaches to the book of Revelation. So clearly, as you can see, we will be looking at a little bit of scripture this evening, but we're not going to be jumping straight headlong into the first verse of Revelation. I need to set this up as a little bit of a background for us. Okay, as I said, we are looking at approaches to the book of Revelation this evening, and I'd like to start by looking at what I would call the interpretative spectrum of the book of Revelation. So if you look at this book, it's very complex, it's densely laden with a lot of symbolism, and we need to be careful exactly how we approach it, because the mindset with which we approach it and the technique and the presumptions that we have in approaching it are going to determine the kind of conclusions that we arrive at when we read this book. So the first, if you could, let me put it this way: if you could imagine interpretation as a spectrum, if you will, and you've got two poles or two extremities to this spectrum. The one pole, or the one terminus, or the one end of it would be the decoding approach that you can see there in your middle panel, and the other one on the opposite end would be what I call an actualizing approach. Now, the decoding approach, basically it focuses in on the details of the thing. It's an interpretative strategy that has basically it views the text as a code that needs to be analyzed and deciphered. So the idea, or at least its goal, is to discover the precise correspondences between the text and specific historic or present or future events. That's the overarching idea of the decoding approach. The second one is what we call the actualizing approach. Now, with the actualizing approach, basically the wish is to convey the spirit of the text, the core message idea that the text embodies, and to perform it within a new circumstance. So obviously in our case, that is, how does it become applicable to us today? Now, this interpretive strategy will usually approach the text in an analogical manner. Its goal is basically to discern similarities and to actualize these. So you'll note as I go through this evening that my presentation is going to lie somewhere between these two extremes, but I'm going to be more inclined to look at this actualizing approach. That is the way that my brain works. That's the way, having looked at everything and tried to analyze everything, it seems to me to be the stronger approach. However, I'm not going to say that we exclusively need to stick to one or the other. We need to find a happy medium somewhere along this line. So based on these two poles, or these two extremes, we can basically say that there are three interpretative strategies. And again, if you just look here in the middle of your panel, you'll see that I've highlighted them for you in green. They are the predictive approach, the preterist approach, and the idealist or the theopoetic approach. Now, the predictive approach, let's jump straight in there. This is basically a decoding approach. This is way over on the decoding side of the spectrum, It generally, though not exclusively, will have a future focus. The interpreters that use this kind of technique see the fulfillment of the tribulations, the millennium, the figures that are mentioned in the book of Revelation as belonging to their time or very close to their time. And there are two general approaches to this. The first one is the historicist or the church historical view, and then the other one there you can see point 2 is the futurist approach. Now, the historicist or the church historical view, basically its interpretation, its decoding approach is focused on the historical aspects. So they view, if interpreters that read the book of Revelation in this way, view the book as a prediction of world history. In other words, if we take, for example, the idea of the seal or the trumpets or the bowl events, they are seen to depict successive unfolding events of history in a general chronological order. So the major assumption here is that these things kind of flow on from one another. A goes to B, goes to C, goes to D, etc. So often, with the historicist view, the climax or the culmination of these historical events is seen to be at or near the time of the interpreter. Now, the historicist view also tends to identify historical movements, in my opinion, a little bit too specifically, and it limits usually the prophecies of the apocalypse or of the book of Revelation specifically to Western church history. It's understandable, but I think a bit lamentable that a lot of the commentaries that we read, a lot of feedback that we get from people is kind of reading our present political situation into the past or into the future when they try to read the book of Revelation. And while it's not impossible, I think we need to be careful of these kind of biases. So that's one of the potential problems with this historicist view. The second view there you'll see in the middle screen, I'll just move my mouse there for us, is the futurist view. Now, in my experience, this seems to be, especially among evangelical circles, the more common way of interpreting the book of Revelation. These kind of interpretations rely heavily on eschatology and an interpretation of the end times. So most often, this type of interpretive approach is heavily dependent on a theology which I'll call dispensationalism. Now, dispensationalism basically, I don't want to go into all of the details of it, but it tends to interpret historical events, and particularly the book of Revelation, as being quite literal. A literal depiction of historical events, and it interprets the timeline as follows. So I'm just going to give you this. So, for example, if you were to have an overview of the book of Revelation here, chapter 1, the dispensationalists would see this obviously as the resurrection of Christ. Then moving on to chapters 2 and 3 would be the church age from the apostles up until today. For example, what the dispensationalists will do is they'll say, well, the 7 churches that are represented in chapters 2 and 3 that are mentioned specifically by name also represent an era of church history. I'm sure some of you have heard this kind of teaching before. I should note, before we even go, and this is not to be hypercritical, I just want us to open our minds and be aware of potential biases when we interpret these things. There's no internal evidence that I can find whatsoever within the text of Revelation itself that would suggest that we need to read these 7 churches as 7 eras or epochs throughout church history. Now, that's not to say that we must limit the book of Revelation in chapters 2 and 3 only to those existing churches and only to the history of those churches. What I would suggest is that they represent a type of a church, usually a lot of them caught up in some kind of idolatry or something that is a little bit off in terms of their worship of the Lord that needs to be rectified. And I would argue that you could find these kind of churches at any point in history or at any point in church history. So just to give you an example, a lot of people would say, for example, well, we're now in the age of Laodicea, the Laodicean church, which was the lukewarm church. And usually this interpretation is fueled by the idea that lukewarm in Revelation means, that I'm not on fire, I'm not passionate about my worship of the Lord, which in itself is a misinterpretation of what the phrase lukewarm means there. But I could more easily claim that rather than just a lukewarm church, what we actually have in our contemporary church is a re-embodiment of the worship of Jezebel and the false worship of the Nicolaitans, and all these aspects that I actually mentioned about other churches. So again, just keep your mind open to these kind of possibilities. Dispensationalists would then argue that chapter 4 verse 1 in particular represents the rapture of the true church from the earth and out of history. And then from verse 2 on and carrying into chapter 5, they would then say that this represents the church in heaven, because obviously we've got this throne room scene, we've got the elders, we've got the angels, the hosts all coming to worship God. And then the dispensationalists would say that chapter 6 from verses 1 to 8, this is the opening of the seals of the book, or of the scroll. They then start a 7-year, very literal 7-year period of tribulation, and then this unfolds as it goes through all the chapters into other events. And then by the time you hit chapters 19 and 20, the idea is that we then represent the second coming and the literal 1,000-year reign of Christ and the final judgment of all humanity, with chapters 21 and 22 marking a new heaven and a new earth moving on into eternity. So that's the way that the dispensationalists would view it, obviously seeing everything as future, as in yet to come. So there is kind of a break. There's this idea that, well, chapter 1 was past and chapter 2 and 3 is past and present, and then everything from chapter 4 verse 2 on must happen in the future. That's why we call it a futurist view. Now there's a modified futurist view. You'll see that I put it there in brackets for you in the middle panel. It doesn't hold as strictly that the visions represent a chronological, remember A to B to C to D must be fulfilled in this order, kind of idea of future history. So for example, they have a modified futurist view, and I do share some similarities with this, although not entirely, but a modified futurist view would say, for example, that the seal events, the trumpet events, the bowl events may actually represent the same successive time periods, but they all still refer to a future period of tribulation, something that is yet to come. Now, the problems or the potential problems with the futurist view, just as much as I said that there were problems with the other view, I believe there are some potential pitfalls with the futurist view that I should just point out. The first is that if everything in the book of Revelation only refer to future events that haven't even come to pass 2,000 years after Christ was born, died, and was resurrected, then the question that I have is, how would this book have any significance for a first century audience, which is what it was actually written for? And the other question that I have is, why would God provide a prophecy for the church 2,000 years ago that it could never understand within its own context, within its own time, and that it's only us that are now in the so-called perfect socio-political climate that can actually understand the political issues or the rhetorical issues that are being addressed in the book? Now, I'm sure that there are theologians that could address me on this, that could provide me with a suitable response to these questions, but there are the kind of things that I have in the back of my mind. So while I am very certain that the book of Revelation is prophetic, that there is a prophetic element to it, I'm not always certain how we should interpret that future event, or how strictly we should interpret that future event as only being of our time or into the future. You then get, as a response, almost as a reaction to all of this, you then get the preterist approach. That's the second major approach that you see here in the middle column. And the preterist approach is basically a non-theological, contemporary, historical approach. So its interpreters would see Revelation, for example, as being strictly a document of its time. You see that this is kind of almost a 180 reaction to the futurist and the historicist views, that they say basically the book of Revelation is ancient literature, or more specifically, it's ancient religious literature, and it reveals the social historical conventions of that time, of its day. Its present relevance, even its future relevance, are often overlooked, which is a problem that I have with the preterist view. because it's so focused on the historical context that it almost neglects the prophetic side of the book, so to speak. So there are two general predictive approaches here, and you can see that I've mentioned them for you here in the middle panel again. The first one is Revelation as a prophecy of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, if this doesn't become clear, you'll see as we go through the book, when I address certain issues, certain symbolism, you can always come back to this initial lesson, and hopefully by the time that you understand the symbolism, the potential prophetic fulfillment of some of these events, you'll have a clearer idea of where I'm going with this. But for now, I hope that you can stick with me. Let's just say that if we believe that Revelation is a prophecy of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, it means that the book of Revelation would have to have been written prior to 70 AD for it to have any prophetic significance. Now, this is already a little bit of a problem, because the consensus at the moment amongst the majority of 20th century academics is that John's apocalypse, or should I rather say the apocalypse of Jesus Christ to John, was written much later, most likely in the reign of Domitian around about 95 AD. But anyway, even if there is an early date to the book of Revelation, for us to assume that it is a prophecy on the fall of Jerusalem would mean that we have to identify Babylon the Great. Now, this is looking ahead to around about chapter 17, thereabouts, that Babylon the Great represents an apostate Israel who aids Rome in oppressing Christians. That's the view that we would have to have. And this view basically would limit all of the prophecies, everything that is included in it, to the salvation, including its aspects of salvation, judgment, all of those things now have to be limited to basically 70 AD and the fall of the temple and all of those events. So it asserts that the prophecies that are recorded in the book of Revelation basically reach their climax by AD 70. So it has no potential relevance for us today in that regard, other than us applying some of those lessons, perhaps in a pastoral sense. So the other one there, the second one, is Revelation as a prophecy of the fall of the Roman Empire. And this would be around about the 5th century AD. Now, for us to get to that conclusion, we would basically have to assume that Babylon the Great is not Jerusalem itself, but actually refers to the Roman Empire, who was the persecutor of the saints up until the 5th century AD. This, of course, infers that Christians are exhorted within these centuries that Rome was dominant, that they were exhorted not to compromise their witness by identifying in any way with an idolatrous Roman pagan system. So the problems of the preterist view, and I'm including both of these, whether it's Jerusalem or the Roman Empire that they assume is being referred to by Babylon the Great, the problem is that both of these approaches have a difficulty explaining precisely how all the predictions in the book of Revelation come to pass before or by the fall of the Roman Empire. You see, there's a lot towards the end, if we look at chapters 19, 20, 21, 22, that we can conclude can't have been fulfilled yet by the nature of what it's discussing, unless you really want to take the approach that it is hyper-spiritual, hyper-symbolic, and that these events only alluded to a coming peaceful church age, etc., etc. So that's the first problem. And the other problem is that because of the way that preterists view the book of Revelation as being only a historical document, it has given rise to a hermeneutic of skepticism, or something that maybe, or a view, I should say, that has become prominent under the hermeneutics of skepticism. And that is basically that the prophecies spoken of in the book of Revelation are not just limited to Jerusalem or the Roman Empire, but they actually have worldwide significance. But the problem then is that they would say, well, John the prophet was merely mistaken and some of these things never came to pass. Now, I don't agree with that view at all, but if you want to try and understand how the later chapters fit in to the preterist view, this is the extreme example of where your logic would have to go to get to that kind of a conclusion. So the third point there, or the third strategy, I should say, you can see there is the idealist approach, or what Gorman calls the theopoetic approach. Now, this is an actualizing approach. Remember, the other two were decoding approaches. They look at the book of Revelation and say, how can I correlate what's described here with particular elements or incidents within history, or within church history, within political history, etc., etc. The actualizing approach, on the other hand, describes the book of Revelation as a timeless, a spiritual, a non-historic book. So it affirms that Revelation is a symbolic portrayal of the ultimate conflict between good and evil, between the forces of God and the forces of Satan. Now, the most radical form of this idealist approach would hold that the book is a timeless view of the struggle and that it will basically never come to a conclusion. So its interpretations don't rule out historical study. You still have to look at the historical context and all of this. However, what the idealist approach does at its most extreme is, again, it's reactionary, so it rejects this decoding approach. And the reason why it doesn't, now it doesn't matter whether it's preterist, whether it's futurist, whether it's looking back, whether it's looking to the future, the issue is that it rejects any kind of a decoding approach, because the idealist approach understands this, well, or I wouldn't say understands the symbolism, but because it understands Revelation as being symbolic, these kind of interpreters would argue that to try and attach particular codes or particular events to these things is basically to violate the genre and the language of the book of Revelation itself. So, for example, I'm just going to read here. It argues that the importance and the truth of Revelation are not limited to its original connection with Rome and the particular historical context. So it's not denying it, it's just saying that its significance is not bound to those events, and that what we shouldn't do is assume that it must be bound to specific future realities. That would be the idealist approach. Now, the problem with it, you've probably figured out by now, is exactly the opposite of the other two views, in that it holds that Revelation never has any it never depicts, if I could put it that way, any final consummation of history. It's always just this cyclical, symbolic thing that goes on, this persistent, ever-engaging battle between good and evil. And the idealist notion also encounters the opposite problem, that it identifies none of the book's symbols with any particular historical event, which is also a problem. So these actualizing approaches, I've given you kind of the symbolic overview, the theopoetical one, but there are two other approaches to it, and you'll see that in the middle. I've listed them for you. The one is what they call a theopolitical approach, and the other one is a pastoral prophetic approach. Now, the theopolitical approach, basically, it's still within the symbolism, but it views Revelation as a document of comfort, most especially a document of protest, with a message that focuses on criticizing injustice, on promoting transformation within the church, encouraging the church itself to remain upright, to remain just, to reject idolatry, apologies, all of these kinds of things. And then the other one that you see is the pastoral prophetic approach, which would view Revelation as a document of church formation, in a sense, something that was written as a call, or to call, I should say, the church to faithfulness in the face of inevitable conflict with hostile world powers. So, in other words, the book of Revelation functions according to this pastoral prophetic approach. It functions in the interests of spiritual purity and single-minded devotion to God. So you can probably see here that if we take the theopoetical idealist approach and we combine it with the political and the pastoral prophetic approach, that they're closely related to one another. They're not really in conflict with one another. They're just slightly different foci, or different viewpoints on the book of Revelation, whether it's focusing on the poetic, whether it's focusing on the prophetic, the pastoral, or the political aspects, because all of those aspects are there. You'll just find that certain interpreters may choose to focus more on one than the other, because that is their niche, or because they see that as something that is particularly of importance for their community. So I would argue personally that all of these approaches should be considered together. as they define the historical context of the letter. So again, whether this is the idealist, the political, or the pastoral, let's have a look at all of them together, because they do actually define the historical context of the letter, and they help us to find a present application and potentially a future fulfillment for these events. So those are the three major interpretations. Now, I'm sure if you haven't figured this out by now, you're probably wondering, what is my approach to the book of Revelation going to be exactly? If I could summarize, and again, summary is probably not going to do absolute justice, and we may jump to conclusions ahead of time, but if I had to summarize for now, I would say that my approach to the book of Revelation is the following. It is that history is cyclical, it's repetitive. In other words, prophecy may have multiple fulfillments. I'm not saying multiple perfect fulfillments, I'm not saying multiple identical fulfillments, but there may be multiple fulfillments to prophecy. So this evening, I just want us to have a look at Matthew chapter 24 quickly. It should be from the Olivet Discourse. I just want to look at verses 13 to 16. This is where the disciples asked Jesus himself, what would be the signs of your coming and of the end of the age? And he says here from verse 13, he says, but the one who endures to the end is the one who will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. And you can see there the next pericope heading there is perilous times in the NASB. But if I just scroll up a bit, Jesus now says something very interesting to the disciples. He says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand the allusion. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get things out of his house, etc., etc. I'm going to stop it there, although it does carry on for a while. But verse 15 there is of particular importance. You can see I've highlighted there the abomination of desolation for you. And just to give you a quick summary from Carl's commentary, basically what happened is that the sign of the devastation, or at least the sign that the devastation of Jerusalem was imminent, that it was about to happen, was the appearance of what Jesus calls the abomination of desolation. And this is not the first time that this term occurs in the Bible. Jesus himself points us back to the writings of the prophet Daniel. And in particular there it is Daniel 9 verse 27, it's Daniel 11 verse 31, and Daniel 12 verse 11. You're welcome to go and read through those in your own time. Now the idea is that this prophecy was in part fulfilled already by 167 BC. So Jesus is in a sense reinstating the same prophecy, because a similar type of event is now about to happen nearly 2 centuries later. So in Daniel, the expression, the abomination of desolation, is usually understood to refer to an object associated with idol worship. In other words, not the worship of Yahweh as God Most High, but some other deficient form of worship that was idolatrous. This was set up in the temple, and this desecrated the holy place. That is why it's an abomination, and it's desolation, because it now leaves it empty, I would guess, of the presence of God. So this abomination was associated in particular with the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple. And if you go and look at 9, let's jump there quickly. Let's go to Daniel 9 verse 26. And let's see what the prophet says here. He says, then after the 62 weeks the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. There we go. So there's the important key component. So it's the sanctuary and the city here that are destroyed according to Daniel's prophecy. Now, the author of First Maccabees, now this is not a book that is in your Bible usually, unless you maybe have a Catholic Bible or a King James version that still includes the apocryphal writings, but the historical book of First Maccabees and of Second Maccabees, the author there basically infers and interprets what happened in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, the events, and I'll explain that just now. He interprets this as the abomination of desolation. So basically he took that phrase, the abomination of desolation, and he applied it to a particular historical incident which happened in 167 BC, when a pagan altar was built on top of the holy altar in the temple in Jerusalem so that abominable offerings could be offered upon it. Now, this was in the time of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and he basically, what he did is he converted the temple that was in Jerusalem as to a shrine in dedication of the Olympian god Zeus. So, and then on that altar, he actually sacrificed a pig, which, as most of you would know, was an unclean animal. And this was obviously such a shocking thing that the writer of First Maccabees would have immediately assumed that this is a fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy said a couple of centuries earlier. Now, just because it is potentially fulfilled centuries earlier doesn't mean that we should rule out the possibility that a prophecy like that could be fulfilled again. And Jesus himself, like the rabbis, recognized that history was cyclical, that events can repeat, and that the historical judgments of God on his people would recur when and if Israel sinned against God. So, sorry, I'm just scrolling down here a bit further in my notes. So there are several features, and I should mention this, of Daniel's prophecy in 9 verse 24 to 27 that do not appear to refer to Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Although he most certainly did desecrate the temple in Jerusalem, he did not, as we read here in verse 26, destroy the city, okay, and the sanctuary, but he did defile it. So more likely, we should probably understand this passage from the book of Daniel to be a messianic prophecy that describes the coming of Jesus, his death, and then the subsequent Roman destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. But what I want you to see is this idea that history kind of repeats itself. Therefore, my assumption is that the book of Revelation symbolically portrays events throughout history. That some of these events have already occurred, that some of these events are occurring right now, and that some of these events have yet to occur. So, for example, when I say that some of these events have already occurred, this means that specific events throughout the age, extending from Christ's first coming all the way to his second coming, his return, may be identified with one or another symbol within the book of Revelation. I also mean, in terms of a present fulfillment of the book of Revelation, that the majority of the symbols that we will encounter in the book are what I call trans-temporal. In other words, they span time, in the sense that they are applicable to events throughout the church age, not limited to one particular fulfillment per se. And then the third one, where I say that some of these things may yet occur in the future, it should be obvious from what I've said before that there must come, especially if we look from chapters 19 on in the book of Revelation, there must come a final consummation of this age, of this present evil age, where salvation and judgment are finally meted out and everything comes to a conclusion. And this is why I say that I view the book of Revelation as both as past, present, and future fulfillment, with all of these ideas in mind. And this is probably what some people would call a modified version of, let me just go back to that panel for us, a modified version of this idealist approach. Some would call it an eclectic approach. In other words, I will sometimes refer to the potentiality for future events or specific past events, but I'm going to suggest to you as we read through it continually that we need to understand that a lot of these things have been going on and are still ongoing within the era that we are in today. So the last thing that I just want to point out for this evening, and I think it's a pertinent question, is why would I choose to read the book of Revelation in this way? Well, firstly, because the book is more than just a prophecy. It's also a circular letter. So in other words, it's an epistle, it's a prophecy, and it fits within the apocalyptic genre. So there's kind of three general areas of literary genre and style that the book fits in. And we can only really or let me say this, if we only decode the book, if we only use that kind of approach to the book of Revelation, we may end up overlooking significant aspects of its message and of its theology. Because, for example, and I'm going to be citing Gorman extensively here, the apocalyptic literature has affinities with prophecy, but its idiom is really quite distinct. There's a lot of overlap, but there are some significant differences. But the basic function of apocalyptic literature is fairly clear. It is to sustain the people of God, especially in times of crisis and particular evil and oppression. The apocalyptic literature both expresses and creates hope by offering a scathing critique of the oppressors, passionate exhortations to defiance of the cultural status quo, if that is against the word of God, obviously, and even sometimes a preparation for confrontation, if needed, and an unfailing confidence that God will ultimately defeat the present evil of this age. So this is usually articulated in apocalyptic literature in symbolic and cryptic language, as you'll be aware from the book of Revelation. Now, apocalyptic literature enables this hope and this resistance, if I could put it that way, amongst the community by revealing the truth of the unseen, the spiritual realities of our age, that such as, things pertaining to God and his kingdom, to heaven, to hell, things relating to future realities and present realities, such as, in particular, theological aspects of judgment and salvation. Now, an apocalypse can, therefore, if you can understand that it can go in all sorts of directions here, but the apocalypse, or an apocalypse, I should say, rather than just the apocalypse, the book of Revelation, any apocalyptic literature can, therefore, have a vertical or a spatial revelation or dimension to it. It can be about the present, it can be horizontal or temporal, it can be a revelation about the future. Sometimes it can be, as in the book of Revelation, that it is both. So in the last book of the Bible, just referring back to my notes here, visions of God, of Christ, and believers and martyrs in heaven. Now you see, this is the spatial vertical component, are intermingled with visions of coming persecution, of judgment, salvation, the new heaven and the new earth. Again, temporal, but on a horizontal plane. So we've got both of these things playing off in the book of Revelation. I think we need to appreciate both of these, because if we miss one side or we slant too much to the one side, I believe that we're in danger of potentially skewing the way that we read this book. The second reason why I prefer to read the book of Revelation in this way is because it is a prophetic book. It's not just apocalyptic, it is prophetic. So if we just go to Revelation 1 verse 3 here, you can see in your left panel, it says there, "Blessed is the one who reads and those who hear the words of the prophecy and keep the things which are written in it, for the time is near." And in chapter 22 verse 7, you can go there in your own time, you'll see that it is reiterated or repeated again that this is a letter, a record of prophecy itself. So what we do need to understand, and where we need to be careful, is that biblical prophecy, and I know this goes against our Western way of trying to perceive and understand things, but biblical prophecy doesn't always have to portray a literal or a linear unpacking of events, so to speak. So it does portray historical events, but not necessarily always in the way that we think. It's not exclusively or even primarily about making pronouncements and predictions concerning the future, although that is a part of it. I'm not denying that, but it's not always the primary goal of prophecy. Rather, if you look through Old Testament prophecy, you'll see that a lot of it is speaking words of comfort and exhortation to the community of Israel, in this case to the church, and or to challenge the people on behalf of God, so that they would renew their commitment to God within their present historical circumstances. So the Old Testament prophets were called by God, sometimes in the context of a visionary experience. You can look at Isaiah chapter 6 for his calling. You can look at Ezekiel chapter 1 for his prophetic calling. But within such a visionary experience, they are called to proclaim the message that God gave them, usually in the form of oracles, yes, but these were later written down, but also occasionally through visions and often in poetic and symbolic language. And Ezekiel and Daniel there are two very good examples of where this visual symbolic language comes to the fore. However, whatever the form of the prophecy, the message was always one of judgment, either on Israel or on its oppressors, or it was a message of salvation. Usually the two would flow together. So keep that in mind. And then what I want to do is just let us go to Isaiah quickly. I think it is. Let me keep the left panel open. If we jump to Isaiah, I hope it is chapter 34 that I have in mind. Let's see here. Was this the one I was looking for? I'm hoping so. Anyway, let's just read through this part, because it does start with God's wrath against the nations. So this is a prophecy through the prophet Isaiah, and it says, "Come near, you nations, to hear, and listen, you peoples. Let the earth and all it contains hear the words of, and all that springs from it. For the Lord's anger is against the nations, and his wrath against all their armies. He has utterly destroyed them, so he has turned them over to slaughter. So their slain will be their slain will be thrown out, and their corpses will give off their stench, and the mountains will be drenched with blood, and all their heavenly lights will wear away, and the sky will be rolled up like a scroll, and all its lights will also wither away as a leaf withers from the vine, or as one withers from the fig tree." He says, "For my sword has drunk its fill in heaven. Behold, it shall descend for judgment upon Edom." Now, Edom was a particular nation that was usually antagonistic to Israel. So can you see here that we've got a literal prophecy that is being spoken against a particular nation here, and just previously against other nations, but it is combined with this apocalyptic symbolic language of the end of the age, the destruction of creation, the recreation of things. So there, the book of Revelation is not unique. Now, I'm sorry, this isn't exactly the scripture that I had in mind, but I think it should suffice to give you the idea of where prophecy and apocalyptic kind of merge together and how they can overlap from time to time. And I think if we were to take this quite literally, then we would have to assume that at the time that Edom was destroyed and judged by God, that, well, the stars must have fallen out of the heavens or fallen away, and the sky must have been rolled up. Now, neither of those two events has happened literally, so it forces us to now reconsider what exactly is God speaking about. And I want you to keep, as we go through this book, always keep it in the back of your mind, this kind of symbolic language that God uses quite often when he talks about ultimate judgment, about end time judgment, and how that is applicable to the church again throughout the age. And the third point that I would just like to make in terms of why I choose to read Revelation in this particular way is because the situational context of the letter, now by that I mean it's the history in which it was written, by whom it was written, for whom it was written, the rhetoric of that culture, the social norms of that culture. That's the situational context that I'm referring to. That situational context would suggest that the primary intent of the book of Revelation was to do what? To challenge the church to conform to the kingdom of God and not the kingdom of Rome. Yes, it has prophetic elements to it, but that's not the principal part of the message of the letter. So it means that if we only have a predictive approach to the letter, it severely limits our application of the message that the Holy Spirit is giving us through the prophet John. So, for example, earlier scholarship on the book of Revelation suggested that it was written to people who were undergoing intense persecution, that it was a letter of comfort in the midst of this. Now, this would probably have been done in the time of Domitian. Remember I said that we have probably a later date towards very close to the end of the 1st century AD. So either through him or through his representatives throughout the province of Asia. However, more recent scholarship has actually revealed, or is starting to question, I should say, whether the persecution was as pervasive in that time. Now we know, for example, at certain points in history, like the reign of Nero, there were moments of intense persecution of the Christian community. And I don't want to undermine that, and I don't want to overlook or ignore that, but that is not necessarily the immediate context of what was happening when the book of Revelation was written. So again, we need to understand that the primary concern here is that the churches would fall into idolatry, or that they would become lax in their worship. So rather than focusing just on one moment of persecution, it focuses on persecution in general, if I could put it that way. So the result is that contemporary scholars would argue that the book of Revelation generally is prophetic in its words of challenge to the community as much as in its words of comfort. It's not just there to say there is a hope beyond all these things. That's part of it. But it is also there to say, church, come out of Babylon. Depart from her and be the church that I've called you to be. Don't engage with the idolatry of the evil world system that you're in. And again, I would extend that to say it's not just in the time of the Roman Empire. That can be as applicable to us today in different ways perhaps, but the underlying spiritual principle is the same. So in other words, Revelation as prophecy should probably be understood as an anti-assimilationist or anti-accommodationist literature. And that's why I think it's important that we start to read through the book carefully, because it's even more significant for us today when we've lapsed back into an era where the sin of the Nicolaitans has crept into the church, where we accept not just blatant idolatry, universalism within our theology, within our philosophy, but that we accept all forms of perversity and things within the church that were never part of God's original plan and purpose. So again, even if we just read through chapters 2 and 3, a lot of those messages to a lot of those churches are going to be applicable to quite a few of us today, and we need to keep that in mind. So in a sense, and this is where I do differentiate from Gorman quite a bit, I'm not overly fond of a strong post-colonial interpretation of the book, and I think that sometimes we can be overly political in the way that we interpret it. But I want you to be aware that at least at some level, the book of Revelation does serve as a kind of resistance literature, that it is a thoroughgoing prophetic critique, so to speak, of the system of Roman power, or in our case, any kind of world power that would substitute the worship of God for any other kind of worship, whether that is worship of politicians, whether that is worship of celebrity, whether it's worship of system or country, however that might be. Right? That basically, if you understand from that perspective, you could see it as one of the strongest pieces of political resistance literature of its age. And I want to throw that out there, but I don't want us to limit our interpretation just to that. I do, however, want us to be aware of that. So that should have covered, and I'm just going to switch in the middle panel back to these again, that should have covered the different ways that we can approach the book of Revelation. I think you've got an idea now of how it is that I will be reading the book of Revelation in particular. So if you were hoping that I was going to kind of jump in and say, well, COVID shows that we are now at this exact point in this chapter, and obviously this is now the unpacking of wormwood and this curse upon the land, blah, 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 blah. Unfortunately, I'm going to say that is not the way that I'm going to be approaching the book. I want us to look at it through all its symbolism as something that has a message for all of the church throughout history and for us today.